once again, This Affable Life, talking to affable people. And I think there's none more affable than Sarah Steele, who is the podcaster for Let's Talk About Sects. Very hard to say that last word, isn't it, Sarah?
Look, I've had a few get it wrong. I had to school the guy on the Today Show when I got a spot on there in how to pronounce sects. It takes a bit of practice.
There's got to be just a little bit of a pause there, isn't it? You know. But I used to have a website called Good Sects, and the tagline was, "We all need good sects." And people like to misplay with that as well. Well, now I've been watching your progress with Let's Talk About Sects, because it's an award-winning podcast. You've done so well with it, haven't you? What's the background, Sarah? What got you involved in wanting to look into cults and sects, of all things?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I always feel like I don't have a very satisfactory answer for it aside from pure interest. And I think it was really about trying to understand the psychological side of it, and
yes.
the fact that these kind of interactions between humans seem to replicate themselves across societies in different countries with entirely different cultural backgrounds. No matter where you go, there seem to be these cultic groups and who use this type of coercive control. And I wanted to understand more about it. And at the time I was listening to so many podcasts, and I looked for one to learn about it from a podcast, and there wasn't one at the time. And now there's a whole bunch, but right then there wasn't one. And I thought, well, maybe I could be someone to do this. And I think that's, I don't know, who am I to go in and look at this thing that I know nothing about? But I guess I was taking it from a documentary perspective, because I studied filmmaking and I've done a bit of writing. So I was looking at it more from the journalistic side of things. Though I'm not also a trained journalist, I have done a bit of journalistic training. So I thought it was something that I was interested in, and I might be able to break down for someone who like me doesn't have that background or understanding. So I guess it was also the gap between a lot of academic writing about these things and a lot of sensationalist journalism that was happening. I thought there was somewhere in the middle that really needed someone to look at it. And I don't think I knew at the time whether I'd be any good at it, but I think what I found was the more people that I spoke to who'd come out of these groups, the more urgent it seemed that people need to understand how they operate, because there are just so many of them and they're doing so much damage to people's lives.
Oh, absolutely. And I admire the approach you take. And I read, and there was an interview in the Sydney Morning Herald about last year, and about you and the writer talked about the fact that it takes about a month's research. Is that correct, for each podcast?
Yeah, and sometimes a bit more depending on the subject.
Okay. Well, you obviously approach it in a very diligent and serious way, which is very good. Now, I've got a number of questions for you, and I think that my listeners or listener, I think I've got 5. No, I've got more than that. But they will love listening to you. Philip Adams is one fellow I listen to a lot, and he always addresses his listener. And he's got quite a vast audience. Now, what I'd really like to ask you, the stories that you feature, some of them are very painful, and they involve forms of psychological, financial, and sometimes physical or even sexual abuse based on human ideologies and spiritual beliefs. Now, the question I've got for you is, how did these stories affect you personally?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one I do get asked a bit. How do I kind of protect my own well-being, because they're very intense subjects to engage with and to look at people's trauma. But in a sense, it's what I find motivating as well, because I've been so lucky in my life and so privileged not to have dealt with any of these things myself, that I feel like it's very little for me to engage with these stories and try to help provide this platform compared to what these people have been through themselves. So if it's something that I can do, and I've had so many people reach out to me now and say that it's been really, really helpful for them, not just guests on the show, but many listeners, that it's just, I think that that's enough for it not to get to me too much. And I think the other thing is that I also, in doing only one episode a month and doing it only 8 months a year, so I do seasons of 8 each
Yes.
year, I do then take a little bit of time off in between to kind of switch off for a while and not engage with it too much. But I think the motivation comes from, it's that thing, isn't it? I just don't feel like you can turn a blind eye to these things. And I think that there's a big problem when people don't engage with the negative, because then how can we improve it and how can we make it better if we aren't aware of what's going on?
Look, I agree with you, and I also congratulate you on the steps that you are taking. It is, you know, doing 8 in a series and then having a break, you know, is a really good thing. Some of the stories that you tell are really awfully painful. You know that I have a background of some years in a religious cult, and I've tried to provide help to different folk through occult information and family support. But sometimes I just have to turn off to it myself because, you know, going through the pain of others, it's often quite similar. And one of the things that people from cults, and I'm sure you've come across this, will say that the program that you're providing, telling stories about other cults, helps people who've been in cults enormously, because when you're within the cult, the belief is that, you know, we're in nirvana, you know, the guru or the leader or whoever it is knows everything and everybody else is wrong. And then you come out and you learn that there's all these other groups that think exactly the same thing. In fact, I used to think that when you saw how cult leaders operated, and they always use the same operandus, can't think of the word.
Modus operandi.
Modus operandi. Thank you very much. Just had a mental blank. Yeah, that they must have gone to the same university and learnt the same course to know how to do what they do.
Oh, it's really incredible how they all come to these same ways of behaving. There are so many overlaps between them. And what I found really interesting recently is also, I've been reading Jess Hill's book, See What You Made Me Do, which is about domestic violence.
Yes.
Yes. And it's really on that same continuum. It's kind of like the one-on-one domestic violence or emotionally abusive relationship, then maybe heads into the cult, where you've got a similar dynamic, but more people under the coercive control. And then really at the extreme, you can get into kind of totalitarian governments and really extreme radical kind of terrorist organizations. And they're all on this same continuum. But Jess Hill talks about this same thing, that like so many people who have had partners who were operating this kind of domestic violence relationship, they all seem to have these same tactics, and it's as if they've all learned from the same guidebook. And it's just, there's something about human nature that leads them all to these same ways of operating. And maybe it's some kind of like defense mechanism, or it's how they've figured out how to operate best in the world, or who knows. But it's astounding how it replicates itself, for sure.
I think that all these groups only need just one only narcissistic sociopath to start it off, whether it's a sporting group or whether it's a political group or whether it's a religious group. And because of those behaviours that are easy to use to manipulate and control people, it goes from there. Sarah, what is the worst story so far, or the worst group that you've come across? Is there one?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, because, you know, I guess I try not to go into too much of the really, really heavy elements in the show, because I don't want to re-traumatize anyone, or, you know, like they can get pretty intense. But it's very difficult sometimes to read court transcripts or, you know, primary materials that are talking about, I guess child abuse is obviously the one that ends up being one of the most difficult. But then I think also, because often that's the stuff that makes the big stories in the news, it's like people think if they've come out of a cult and that didn't happen to them, that maybe their experience wasn't so bad. And I think you can't undervalue the emotional abuse that happens in those groups and what the effects that has on someone's life and how that affects them for the rest of their life as well. So yeah, I think there's a couple of groups I've started looking into, and I've kind of stepped back and said, oh, I'm not even sure if I want to go there, because there's just, you know, such awful stuff that's happened. There's one Canadian group. Now, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but I've had a couple of people ask me to cover it, and it sounds so intense that it's going to be so difficult to look at. But then at the same time, it's a difficult question. Does it need to be covered again? Like, that had so much sensationalist coverage at the time that maybe I have nothing to bring to that story.
Yeah, your approach though is different, because you do it in a careful, modulated way. One of the groups that I think of, and I think you've covered them, the family from the hills out of Melbourne.
Yeah, Anne Hamilton Byrne. That was the first episode that I did. And I spoke to Ben Shenton, who came out of the family. He was one of the children in the family. And yeah, I mean, what a shocking story. And that there really hasn't really been any justice for the kids out of that group. Yeah, absolutely shocking.
I read the book written by Sarah Hamilton Byrne. I think she changed her name for a period. She became a doctor.
She did, yeah. It's Sarah Moore. I think she changed her name.
Sarah Moore, yeah. Is she still alive, or has she passed?
Sadly, I understand she. I think there was. Yeah, she passed away.
Yeah,
sadly.
But she did actually go back to the group after I think she was struck off as a doctor because she was self-medicating. But when you read her book, which I read some years ago, and when you understand how cruel that group was, it's a wonder that she was able to do her medicine anyway, you know, and to make such progress in her life. Yeah, that's a really bad one, I think. But there are others like them.
Yeah, so, yeah. She came across, to me, she came across really as an incredible woman, and yeah, I just would have so much sympathy for whatever she felt that she needed to do to cope. But yeah, I read that book as well, and I thought she was quite incredible.
Yeah, that's what I felt. I'll tell you a funny story there, which links to the group that I was in. There were some similarities between the family and our group. Fortunately, there was not the abuse of children and the adoption of children from families and all that sort of nonsense. But there was one very strong similarity, and that is that Anne Hamilton Byrne and Violet Pryor could have gone to the same dressmakers.
Oh, she had a fashion sense, did she?
Oh, she had an absolute fashion sense, and you know, always appeared blonde with her hair permed and coiffured in great, amazing ways. She was kind of like an aging Dolly Parton, although she wouldn't have aged as well as Dolly has. Well,
I'm a big Dolly fan, I have to admit.
Dolly is an amazing person. I mean, that she all her songs she's written herself, and yeah, she's an extraordinary woman, don't you think?
Well, and she does wonderful things for like reading for young people in kind of rural America as well. She's quite incredible.
Oh, that's right. That's great. Now, tell me, when you come to do your stories, how do you? Sometimes you've actually interviewed people directly, and quite often you have. Are there any stories that really resonate with you and we talked about Sarah, and that's one example, but others where that person's life has really, you know, turned around immensely because of the background, or because of their approach to their background.
Yeah, I would say most of the people I speak to, there are a lot who are still very damaged by what they've been through, and completely understandably. But most people I speak to, I think they've managed to turn things around. And I think that it's often because those who are willing to speak to me, they have done some work in engaging with what they've been through. Otherwise, they wouldn't be prepared to speak to me about it, because, you know, there are people who've had that background, and also completely understandably, they just don't want to engage with it at all. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to, it just is it's too triggering for them.
Yeah.
And I completely respect how anyone deals with trauma, and that's totally fine. But I have huge concerns about what's going to happen in the future if you haven't dealt with that in some way. Like, how is that going to come up later and affect your life? So I do find often that the people who are speaking to me, they've likely gotten some therapy. They've likely spoken to a counsellor to try and deal with what they've been through. They may still be doing that. It can be very ongoing work. But there are, they're just, I honestly have so much admiration for almost everyone that I've spoken to, because I just think, again, I think, how lucky am I that I haven't ever had to deal with anything like that? But what an incredible person it must be who can have this entire worldview, that they are completely convinced that this is the way that the world works, and also that it's their path to salvation, usually, and then can manage to see through that and realize that it was incorrect and change their whole perspective. It just, I think it must take something really special to be able to do that. And I think if they can really realize what an incredible strength they have to have done that, rather than falling into feeling shame and embarrassment, which, you know, that's also, I would say, the fault of the media in a lot of ways, but society in judging people for, you know, having fallen prey to a coercive control leader. I mean, I just don't think they deserve any judgment for that. And I guess often they might have done some things to be ashamed of in that situation, but I think we really have to look at this with such sympathy and also admiration, that I don't think that shame and embarrassment is what these people should be coming out with.
Thank you. I also agree with you. What about the children that are born into these groups? It's hard enough for, you know, the adults who, you know, they might have been young, as I was, who choose to go into something that's a bit extreme or a bit strange. But what about the children? Have you confronted that very much? People who've been born into it over generations?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And I think it's a really important subject, because I've spoken in great detail with people who were born into certain groups, and they felt that they never had that choice. So that's really difficult. And if their parents chose to join and then they were born in, it can create a lot of conflict with that relationship. And there are so many layers to it. But it's a question I come down to an awful lot, because obviously, you know, religious freedom is absolutely vital in a progressive society. But where do we draw that line that is going to protect children? You know, I think the line, to me, has to be drawn where you're looking at infringements on people's human rights. And that often is where children come into it, children being born into these groups that are often violent or in other ways controlling, and they never had that choice. So it's such a difficult subject, but it's one that's really important to engage with. And I'm kind of straying off the topic a little bit, but I guess on the religious freedom side, I just really always want to be clear that I don't think that cultic groups, from my perspective and from all the groups I've looked at, I don't think they really have anything to do with religion. It's much more that religion can often be an easy shorthand for someone to claim you know, that they're getting the word of God, and so they're a real authority. So
Yes.
it's an easy use for them to get that control that they seek. But you know, these groups are coming from like martial arts schools and, you know, new age this and whatever. So it's not really about religion at all. It's just that often that line seems to get blurred because you're talking about religious freedom. And so what's your freedom to bring up your child in your religious belief system? Well, I think you do have that right. You absolutely have that right, as long as that religion isn't damaging or harming anybody.
Yes, yes. I'm actually, I don't mind yet that you've strayed into that area slightly, because that's an area of great passion for me. And one of the issues that I often raise is with particularly the exclusive brethren schools, where I think it's still the case today, and there's been no evidence to prove otherwise, that students in those schools can never aspire to tertiary education. And I'm talking about genuine tertiary education. They can't go to university. They can't decide to become doctors or lawyers or engineers, or even teachers in the normal sense of the word. Most of them come out of those situations to work in businesses run by people within the brethren. So, of course, the profits can then be channeled back into the organisation. And I think that in freedom of religion, we should allow every religion to run their own schools, but our standards should be very high, and they're not high enough, because those schools still get vast sums of money from government, and their kids, you know, there's no future for them really, aside from being within the group. So you got me on my little bandwagon there.
Happy to provide.
I don't know if you had a chance to hear my interview with Lara Kaput to do with the Jehovah's Witnesses, but she told the story that most people who come out of most young people in Jehovah's Witnesses become window cleaners, she says, because you know, they're running their own business. They can stop when they want to. They can have contact with others to try and proselytize, or at least tick those boxes, and so on. But yeah, it's very sad, because you know, you take a group of 50 people, and you know, some of them are labourers, some of them are geniuses and professors and so on, and some of them you know, have disabilities, and all kinds of things, you know, mix in a family, in a number of people.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And that's also, I mean, that's the whole problem with kind of poverty in the world as well, and in societies. It's that, you know, you've got this whole system that, who knows if that kid that's growing up in complete poverty somewhere could be a genius who could change the world, because we're not giving them those opportunities to thrive. Like, we as a human race could just be so much more incredible if everyone had the opportunity to be at their full potential. And whether that's a person who, you know, has limited potential in certain aspects, or someone who is able to, you know, yeah, I think that's just really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, I really want to bring this to a close, not because we've got lots more that we can talk about, but I'd like to ask you to talk just a little bit more about you seem to think, and I do as well, but that anybody can get caught up in a cultic type group. Do you want to unpack that any further? You must have given that a lot of thought over the time that you've been doing the podcasts.
Yeah, I have, absolutely. And that kind of does feed back into that point of sometimes people are born in as well, and they don't make that choice. So I think that really, you know, people who kind of cast aside this idea, oh, well, they're foolish and that would never happen to me. I would never get myself in that situation. So whatever. Well, there are people being born in who never made that choice, which is already a problem. But on top of that, I think that that's a very simplistic perspective to have. And I think it's maybe a self-protection that makes you think, oh, I would never have fallen for that, because it's an easier way of believing that, you know, the way that you interact with the world. But right now, I think it's just becoming more and more clear. I'm seeing like family members start to believe all kinds of conspiracy theories. that are not based in reality. It's proliferating across America. It's becoming huge at the moment. And it's just becoming more and more clear how anyone can fall into these belief systems that aren't really based in a reality. But I guess on top of that, I mean, now that I've spoken to so many people who've come out of these groups who did choose to join, as well as who are born in, these are like wonderful people. These are like intelligent, wonderful, lovely, you know, just like good-hearted people who wanted to contribute something to the world and or improve themselves or do something really good. And you know, the only thing that they have in common is that they happened to follow the wrong leader. And I think that could happen to anyone for sure. Like the more groups that I look at, the more I think, oh yeah, that's one that I could have seen myself joining. You know, there's some kind of wonderful commune where everyone was looking to all contribute to, you know, I don't want to say like a socialist way of life, that whatever it is, it's like
world peace.
well, yeah, you know, whatever it is. But I guess the other thing is that often the thing that they do have in common is they're at a turning point in their life. They're either a university student, maybe moving out of their parents' home, trying to reassess like what is their life going to be about and who do they want to be. And that's a prime point where if you see something that seems to have a great answer, that's of course you join it with gusto and figure out how to devote your life to it. Or maybe you've come out of a marriage, you've come out of a divorce, and it's, you know, you're reassessing your life and you're trying to think about what do I really want to do in this world. And so that's the thing that they have in common. And everyone goes through those experiences. And if you don't, well, what are you doing? I mean, you should reassess your life every now and again and figure out what you're trying to do with it. I think that's really important. So yeah, I think it's really, the more people I've spoken to, the more it's confirmed that belief, because there are so many good people, and what they're trying to do is so good that it's also just, it feels so frustrating that there are these wonderful people who are contributing all of their generous energy to something really that's usually lining some dude's pockets. Sometimes a woman, but mostly a dude.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, look, it can be either. Look, question for you: do you think you'll ever run out of stories for Let's Talk About Sects?
Yeah, I don't reckon I will. I've had that question a few times. Oh, surely you're going to run out soon. I'm sorry, the list it grows every week. I get another email from someone who tells me about a group that I've never heard of before. So yeah, I think I could be doing this for the rest of my life, and I would probably not run out of stories. Sad to say. Human
nature. That's the problem. Sarah, it's been lovely talking to you. I really want to encourage you with what you're doing. Take just a couple of minutes to give us a promo, a bit of self promo. Tell us about what's coming up next on Let's Talk About Sects. Maybe give the listener a little bit of an idea of how many people are listening to this wonderful program.
Well, it's in the tens of thousands. So that's,
wow.
Yeah, it's incredible. I've got a list of the season 4 episodes that I'm hoping to do just over on my desk.
Okay.
I've had a few emails from people who want to share their stories, and I'm really hoping that I'm going to be able to provide that platform, and potentially yourself, if you'll have me.
I would. There'd be something terribly wrong with me if I wouldn't say yes to that. But particularly seeing you've been so kind as to allow me to interview you. So Sarah, thank you very much for your time today, and all the best with Let's Talk About Sects.
Thanks very much for having me.